And hello, Hearts of Oak. Thanks so much for joining us once again. And it is wonderful to have Dr. Naomi Wolf back with us again. Naomi, thank you so much, as always, for giving us your time.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a delight to be back on your show.
Always good. It's been forever long. I think actually we had met up in the middle of you being on the show before, but so much to talk about. Obviously, your Substack, Naomi Wolf. Make sure to the viewers and listeners to make use of that, and that is your handle, your X handle. So much, but maybe you're up there in the Northeast. You're up there, kind of the up there, New York area, and you've got an understanding of what has happened with Mamdani. And I've seen a number of your posts. You did a video, and we're doing this just, I think, 2 days before, because we're doing this on the Tuesday, going on Thursday. But I saw you did a video about Mamdani, and it's been fairly quiet in the UK after his election on the 4th of November, I think. It's been silence. Give us your perspective there of what it's been like, because the UK viewers will not really know what's been happening.
Sure. I think it's very notable and concerning that the UK has blocked, what is obviously a story of great global interest, which is the communist takeover of our America's center of financial activity, and among other centers, arts, real estate, and so on. It's worrying, because it means, like, you can learn a lot from what is censored and who censors, of course, and it means that the people who have Britain in thrall are the same people cheering for the success of this overthrow, essentially. And I've called it the Red-Green Revolution. A lot of other people are calling it that. It's a really interesting phenomenon in history, because radical jihadi Islam, and I am very reluctant. I never want to, cast a whole religion with a broad brush. I don't. I mean, I don't want to be racist. I don't want to be ethnocentric. But radical Islam is a real thing that is really being weaponized to take out, essentially, Western Europe and now North America. And behind that is a global Marxism, and behind that is an oligarchy. So it's quite a series of concealments. And it's odd, because radical Islam obviously is a theocratic, God-based system, at least in its own mind, and Marxism is atheistic, and so it's just bizarre that they're kind of joining forces, but also strategically brilliant, because use something aggressive and scary that people are told you're racist if you oppose it, to seize the means of production, the law, public spaces. We're seeing that all over Western Europe, North America. I keep saying on X memo, because it's so clear that, big prayer demonstrations in Grand Central are the same memo as big prayer demonstrations in downtown London, and big prayer demonstrations in et cetera. And the beheading of baby Jesus at a creche is the same memo in Germany or Brussels as the torching of churches in England and Canada, and so on. So it's a war, and behind that war are the people who are going to administer the means of production once they're seized. And you see that very clearly in Marxist New York now. So I've been very active in the Mamdani story. I actually advised a candidate in the last election for she was running for city council. And I have a lot of questions about, there was a lot wrong with the election. The ballots were not counted properly. There's a lot of opacity. There, a number of bizarre obfuscations. And New York state law gives any voter the right to call for a 3% hand count of the ballots. And I tried with the New York Elections Board, and I was blocked and blocked and blocked illegally. And then I tried to get a lawyer, and not a single lawyer, even on the right, would represent me, because I think they've seen what happens to people who do challenge the vote, who do ask to look at the votes. They get destroyed, like the former mayor of New York. And, President Trump until he was president, right? They were trying to destroy him for election denial. And I think that that's so bizarre because I was an advisor to the Gore campaign during the 2000 election, and everyone counted the vote right up to the Supreme Court. It was a contested election, and it was completely constitutional, normal, legal at that time to count the vote. And I think it's very disturbing that we don't even know that this guy was elected correctly, and we're not allowed to count the vote. I just don't believe that someone whom no one had heard of in New York City appeared out of nowhere. I mean, there are a number of anomalies, which I won't bore you with, but one of the most striking is you could vote for Mamdani twice on the ballot. Queens, where he's from, was treated differently in terms of vote counting from any other borough. And you're not allowed to see the software, but his margin of victory was exactly the amount that it would have been if the machines were scanning a vote for him by mistake twice as 2 votes. I just want to see, but I'm not allowed to see. Anyway, having said that, it's clear that, it's kind of impressive that as soon as he got inaugurated, not elected, he was elected in November and he was inaugurated in January. He's rolling out, not just he, but the people behind him, who I think were the same people behind the Biden administration, certainly are the people destroying Britain. He and his team have rolled out a number of highly symbolic declarations of victory and of radical restructuring of what New York is and what America is by extension. So, for instance, all the major landmarks were illuminated green for Muslim Heritage Day. That, to my knowledge, that's never happened before. And it takes a huge amount of coordination and permitting to accomplish that, which is worrying, right? It means that there's giant forces behind that. You don't get a bunch of random landlords in New York to say, okay, light up, Moynihan train station with, or municipal landlords for that matter. That's easier to do. But all these private landlords are like, okay, green, and it just feels like the rollout of Nazi iconography everywhere in 1933. I'm not trying to compare him yet to National Socialists. I'm just saying they were very, very, very good at propaganda and kind of declaratory gestures of dominance. And that's what we're seeing. We've got, it's like so deliberate. He chose the chief counsel of New York City, meaning the guy in charge of all the law in New York City, like the Attorney General of New York City, who was Al-Qaeda's chief counsel. And this is a city that has suffered so much from 9/11. So a slap in the face, a ritual humiliation, right? Plus very dangerous for our national security. That means that you've got to think about New York, Manhattan especially, is an island, and just bridges and tunnels link it to the rest of the world. And if the whole municipal administration is in the hands of people who are aligned with destroying New York, it's innately a very, very dangerous security situation. You had this young woman who's in charge of tenant advocacy, I believe, who has declared that they're going to abolish private property, or that she's going to make sure that, the goal of the administration is for the state to take possession of properties so as to dismantle racist, capitalist, white supremacist property ownership. So I should probably pause, but to me, this is so ironic as a single mom, a broke single mom who saved for years to buy one little rental property so I could have an income when I retire because I had no income. The quickest way for working class or legal immigrants to move, to have upward mobility is to save up, which they do, very laboriously for those rental properties, and to call that white supremacy is just very scary because how can I put it? New York is the center of many, many worlds. It's the center of a multi-billion-dollar real estate industry. So you're really sending a signal. Florida homeowners must be thrilled every time someone like that opens their mouth, because you're sending a signal out of New York that property is not going to be safe. And then you've got very scary gestural, symbolic activities, like the stripping of the Holocaust Memorial's definition of anti-Semitism, or a Holocaust agency. I may not have the exact name right, to include anti-Semitism and other forms of discrimination. He stripped that away as one of the first things he did. And I'll tell you, as a New Yorker, well, you were there recently, we have environmental problems. Half of our kids aren't reading at grade level in the public schools between 3rd and 8th grade. We have crime issues. We have, infrastructure issues. We have so many things.
But at least your buildings are green.
Right, exactly. But the fact that that was his priority says to me that it's going to be at least 4 years of gestural degradation of capitalism and Jews, and I guess the American way of life, really. I mean, not that Jews and the American life are the same, but we kind of, yes, because New York never singled out one group. New York was never even a slave city, right? Yes, there was discrimination until 1964, but New Yorkers have never created a policy in which it's like, this group is more equal than others. And that's what we're seeing so clearly in Britain, that, Muslims are treated right, more equally than native-born British people. And there's a method to that. That's my analysis.
Well, it kind of does connect with London. I've been in London 22 years, and you see it as a melting pot, but yet everyone doesn't seem to be equal. When I came here, you seem to have everyone just got on. Everyone was equal in terms of they lived in London. They were human beings, but there was such a mix of ethnicity, of faith, of upbringing. But yet we seem to be moving towards Islam having a more protected status. And it seems to be my worry is that Mamdani uses Sadiq Khan in London as a role model. And my worry is, and I saw you posted that, something that he's actually looking at South Africa for a model of how to do things. And I don't know if he's ever been to South Africa. I personally would probably not want to go. The stories I've read, the South Africans I've talked to, but it's concerning kind of where he's looking, and you're seeing where this is going. And I wonder, are the American press, are they really holding him to account? Because in the UK, Sadiq Khan he hasn't been touched at all in the media. He can do whatever he wants. I don't know what it is with Mamdani in the US.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I feel like it's the same group. And I definitely, in my podcast, I also noted that, the designer visually, and these things are important. I mean, when I was an advisor to the Clinton reelection team and to Al Gore, part of what I did was iconography, because it's very important how things look, that plays on our emotions, our sense of aspiration, our national identity. And it's not trivial. And the weird coats of the Biden women during the inauguration, I don't know if you remember them, they were all in weird kind of Hunger Games, long, Maoist, brightly colored coats. And, they weren't fashionable in any dimension, right? And that always is worth noting, because it means that there's an imposition of another ideology. So that his wife, Mamdani's wife, I'm sorry, that's another conversation, was wearing the same unfashionable Maoist coat. And literally in another image, a Maoist, like literally it's called a Mao jacket, right? With the collar. So the reason that scares me is I think, I did lots of analysis of the Biden administration, and it was clearly China, with other secretive globalists. And then it turns out that, the Biden family took millions of dollars from a Chinese asset, and God knows who was running the country during those years, but probably agents of China. And I fear that it's the same team because of the look and the rollout of iconography. I mean, remember the Biden years, there was constant humiliation. You've got to look at the symbolism. It's not trivial that they kept trotting out, I love the LGBT community. It was not an accident that the Biden administration kept showcasing people in the military who were in dresses or really deep in sexual perversion or were furries. Like that was ritual humiliation of the United States of America. It wasn't an accident that those years saw the removal of statues of our leaders, of Jefferson and so on. It wasn't an accident, like all those stories of people, having sex in congressional hearing rooms. Though I can tell you, as someone who has been around the White House and Congress, that is literally impossible unless it's authorized. It is not, you cannot have sex in a congressional hearing room unless the security team knows that there's going to be sex in a hearing room. But that's really important. It means that it's orchestrated humiliation. And my real worry, and this is just the beginning, my real worry is that the Mamdani years are going to be 4 years of dramatic ritual humiliation with confiscation of assets, for sure, and a demonstrated ruination of our greatest city, the way I think London has demonstrated its ruination very flagrantly, right? And I'm worried they're going to seek to change the Constitution so that he can run for president. I think they want him to be president.
Let's hope and pray that doesn't happen. But I agree with you. I think that is a frightening trajectory, which could certainly happen. And you'd reposted over in the West Coast in Seattle. It was Katie Wilson as the new mayor, and a weekend I think it was Libs of TikTok had said a weekend, and she's now called the police to stop arresting those for open drug use. And I'm wondering how you see kind of the urban area. You've got New York, you've got Seattle up there, you've got California with all of the chaos that it has. I think I saw Miami in the last, 2 months ago, flipped from Suarez, who was the Republican mayor, over to Democrat mayor. I'm kind of your kind of thoughts on how this works in those big urban areas, those big cities that are very influential.
Mm.
And if we see the collapse of those, I mean, New York is iconic. Seattle is iconic, and Miami, a huge important city. How do you see that happening, and the damage that does, I guess, to businesses? Because if everywhere comes like San Francisco, I mean, God help those cities.
God help those cities. Well, I think it's a very clever way to wage war. Take down one city after another, create a beachhead, and no one realizes it's war. And the money flowing. I mean, Sam Antar, who was a CFO of an electronics company called Crazy Eddie, did a really brilliant analysis of how money goes from Democratic administrations in cities to NGOs. The NGOs get out the vote and elect, and also launder donations from rich people, park them offshore, and so on. Then they elect a Democratic administration, and the cycle begins again. So, and I think President Trump knows that. That's why he's gone after NGOs. But it was eye-opening in my recent advising of a candidate in New York. It was working class Black and Hispanic candidates who were saying these NGOs in Brooklyn, in working class and poor areas in Brooklyn, do not want to solve homelessness. They don't want to solve drug addiction. They just want to perpetuate themselves and keep, scooping up the money. And I think that's true. And like, who are Democrats now? I was indeed just at a Buddhist retreat, and I met a lot of Democrats. And a lot of them are employed by nonprofits. So there is a whole alternative economy that's kind of about perpetuating leadership and a way of doing business. These go together because if you've got a mayor of Seattle, for instance, who's working closely with NGOs, she can change the policy, and the NGOs, like, she can say, okay, don't arrest people doing drugs on the street. She can say that to the police. And then the NGOs adapt with their own programs. Let's bring people sandwiches as they're shooting up on the street. And then you have a completely different Seattle. And it doesn't take much. And I've seen this happen, especially on the West Coast, in LA, in Portland, in a tiny town called Corvallis. It was so interesting. A relative of mine lives in Corvallis, tiny, blissful, idyllic little Western town. And first, the homeless people, and I have a lot of compassion. If you're homeless, it's bad. First, they were allowed to pitch tents outside of the city. Then the policy changed, and they were invited to pitch tents in a square in the center of the main residential area where there were a lot of elderly people and children. So pretty soon, elderly people and children stopped going to that park. It became kind of territorially the homeless people, and the drugs went with that. Then they brought in porta potties, right? Then they brought in every Saturday a free clothing, anarchist run, like Marxist run distribution center. So I can't walk through that park anymore. It's very scary. And my 80 plus relative can't walk through that park anymore. I think what it does, I do think this is my husband's view, and I think he's right. I do think it's definitely a real estate play, because I do see in each of these cities, they ruin the most sought after residential areas, and then people flee, and then BlackRock or Vanguard can swoop in and get the properties for pennies on the dollar, right? You'll own nothing and you'll be happy. Then they in turn rent the properties out to people who can't afford to buy, or someday the policies will change and these areas will become nice again, and then they'll own, these very valuable properties. But I think it's also a way to make war on the United States. I mean, think about cities. In LA, if you can't walk, the real war is against pedestrian interaction. It's too scary to walk. You can't walk, you can't chat, you can't run into people and have new ideas. Women, start to live inside because it's not safe. You see that across Europe. Children don't go out. What you get is, combine that with the Islamicist occupation of space, including by sound, right? Like the call of the muezzin, which used to be a private thing in a mosque, and now it's everywhere, but church bells aren't everywhere, right? What you get is a disemboweling of American cities, and with that, an impoverishment of all the things that happen in cities. The arts, counterculture, new ideas, new businesses, they just become dormitories, right? If they exist at all. And I mean, I didn't want to walk around London. And London for hundreds of years has been the great, if you look at memoirs and diaries, the great walker's paradise. No longer. So and then when you elect the leadership, a Sharia leadership, which is the next step, right? After the sure do drugs in the street, it's already tenderized for you, as my husband would say. The last thing I want to say about this is, again, I assess all of these kind of by habit with a consultant's point of view. And in no world, Peter, is let's have more people doing drugs openly on the street at the top of anyone's policy wish, any constituency. No one, they're serving no one by making that happen. And that's how you know that it's an alien agenda.
No, I agree. It doesn't serve anyone. It has to be Brand's thoughts on it's the real estate market and buying it up. Something has to make sense in the chaos. Let me ask you about. I want to ask you about the childhood vaccines, but I want to touch on Minnesota, because I saw you'd put up something and that fitted in with the expose in Minnesota, and you put up about the Hilton Hotel there banning DHS agents. And of course, Minnesota, that's where Nick Shirley has gone viral on talking about the huge fraud. I think 9 billion was a figure I'd seen. It could be up to that. Tell us about Minnesota. I mean, how can a kind of private property just stop the government entering in, and all this about this Social Security or Medicare funding or however you call it. This could be the biggest fraud in history, in US history. The numbers are staggering. How have you seen this happening? I guess that expose, but also hotels denying the government the right to actually get rid of people who shouldn't be there legally.
Right. It's a great question, because what that Hilton did in turning away ICE agents or DHS agents is totally illegal. You cannot discriminate in housing in America. You can't. I mean, I'd have to look at the Hilton's terms of service, because maybe some clever lawyer has said we reserve the right to refuse service to anyone, in which case they can, but legally you can't. And you're seeing, like, this goes back to Mamdani's team. They're saying things like, we have to make white areas pay more. We have to, dismantle gentrification by white people. Totally illegal. It's called redlining in America. And usually it's done to Black people, that their realtors won't show them certain areas because they know that the neighbors don't want Black people moving in. And it's totally illegal. And people have won, as they should, big settlements, when that happens. But it's completely unlawful as of 1964, the Civil Rights Act. Now, what you're seeing in Minnesota with the impunity, and that's what I felt, right? Because these people got busted once. They said, oh, we're really sorry. And then they went and did it again the same night or next night. So what you're seeing, I think, and you're going to see it more and more, it's already happening. It's happening in New York, is a war between municipal and state governments and the federal government. And that's very ugly and very scary, because that way the breakup of the nation, could unfold. I mean, it took a lot to unite the 13 colonies, and we almost broke up our country in the Civil War. It takes a lot to unite all these states. And our system of balance, you don't have the same system, but our system of balance of states' rights and the authority of the federal government is very, very delicate and complicated. So what I saw in that impunity with which the Hilton hotel owners were saying, too bad, we're not going to house ICE people even though we're busted, is a chain of state level in Minnesota corruption on the side of the owners, right? That goes all the way up to the governor, Tim Walz, right? And probably the attorney general and anyone who would, judges, right? We've seen that. Anyone who would try a discrimination case, these owners already know there's really no exposure for them, because this corruption goes all the way up. It's very third world, by the way, knowing that, I've got the judges in my pocket, I've got the governor in my pocket. And the same with this massive Somali fraud, millions and millions and millions, if not billions across the country of dollars. Again, you can't do that unless everyone's in on it in the community. And so it does, and you can't get everyone, like people have tried, the mafia, right? Have tried to create fraud structures that effective since time immemorial. But in order to have, and I keep going back to this, is, from my background in politics, in order to have such a sophisticated, all in, everybody knows that there are no children in this daycare center. We're going to get $23 million anyway. We're not scared. We don't even bother spelling learning correctly. To have that level of money flow and impunity, it has to be set up at the highest levels. And I think that Biden's State Department, and maybe the Obama State Department before that, set up this system of bringing in, a ton of immigrants from failed states full of corruption. Like, notice where so many of our immigrants are coming from, places like Pakistan and Somalia that just don't have a working rule of law. They don't think about fraud the same way we do, right? That's who's being solicited to come to the West. And then, much like Sam Antar's analysis, those people get bought off with millions of dollars in taxpayer money. They reliably turn out the vote for Democrats, and it's a closed system. And it hasn't been interrupted. And it's probably how the last few Democratic administrations got elected, because their policies are terrible. So that's my analysis of that Hilton Hotel moment. Like, that owner was not nervous about repercussions. He knew that he would be, if anything, rewarded by the power structure in Minnesota.
Yeah, and just one thing on that, I saw, I think it was Tim Waltz called Nick Shirley a conspiracy theorist YouTuber for highlighting. Someone's just highlighted, and he said he had found $110 million of fraud in a day. Great video from just some 23-year-old going out. I wish I was doing that when I was 23, but going out and highlighting that. And those powers above, they just mock and ridicule a kid who is actually highlighting and it's that kind of looking down the nose of someone who actually is doing the groundwork, is doing better than any reporter out there, and is just mocked. And to me, that kind of shows the gap we have of politicians on the left, but kind of that gap between ordinary people and, I guess, those above.
Right. Yeah. I mean, what else has he got other than to call Nick Shirley a, conspiracy theorist YouTuber? But I think the point I would take away is, excuse me, it doesn't really matter because, as you said, the media isn't going to cover, or is not going to cover fairly, whatever the legacy media, whatever Nick Shirley found. And the other thing I would say, no disrespect to Nick Shirley, he did a great job, is that's pretty basic journalism. Like, those are nonprofits. So all of their records are public. They're in a database, and every reporter should be doing that kind of work. But also, they're called 990s. Every nonprofit, you can see, for instance, I saw that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation was funding a lot of gender stuff in schools, in public schools, gender, LGBTQ, gender, just from looking at their 990s, like millions of dollars. So you wonder, how did schools all get so crazy? It's right there in the, no disrespect to the LGBTQ community, but most parents want their kids to learn math and reading and science. And it's all there in the 990s. So God bless, Nick Shirley, is that his name? But shame on the legacy media. But you mentioned, let's go back to the fact that Mamdani's rule, which is so relevant to international capitalism, right? A Marxist takeover of kind of the world's financial capitalist center, isn't being covered by the Financial Times or the Times of London, in detail. Like, what is that? That's not normal. And when there is coverage, it's very hagiographic. It's very laudatory. Like, oh, they're the 21st century couple. So it's a stitch up. I don't think we know yet fully by whom, but the fact that Time magazine isn't going to interview Nick Shirley, and that the Financial Times isn't going to tell investors in London what's going on in New York, that's really shocking. And it's concerning, because it means that the powers that be have really walked away from capitalism, right? They don't, like, if the Financial Times doesn't inform investors about what's going on in New York, they're really no longer serving a capitalist agenda, right? They're like, it means they've washed their hands of capitalism, essentially. Or that the downside of covering it is so great, there's going to be blowback. But who is that? I don't know.
Oh, exactly. Let me end up on something that President Trump has just done, and that is on childhood vaccines. I think I saw a Daily Clout Substack piece that was titled, what was it titled? It was U.S. recalibrates childhood vaccine schedule. Federal health officials say the updated childhood vaccine schedule preserves core protections while giving families clear guidelines, greater flexibility, and alignment with international standards. And for the viewers and listeners, please do make use of the Daily Clout Substack, and you'll find similar pieces. But it's that I'd seen President Trump's Truth Social post about European or about Americans of 72 vaccines in the childhood schedule. Europeans have 11 and the US have 72, and reducing that down. Um, I mean, it's taken a while for this to happen. Probably a
Mm.
lot of us were hoping this would happen sooner.
Yeah.
The flip side is President Trump does have a lot on his plate. I get that. Um, but I think we are getting where we would like to be in terms of the restrictions on vaccines and in terms of parents not being pushed down
Mm.
this line of getting jabs that actually their children don't need and aren't beneficial and simply are there for big pharma. How did you see this announcement? And is it as positive as it looks?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you're right that it's taken a while. It's, a year since President Trump was inaugurated, which just seems amazing. Um, and certainly, those of us in the Maha camp have been frustrated with a lot of the slowness of his action on a lot of the corruption related, especially to mRNA injections, but also the childhood vaccine schedule, which is ridiculous. I think it's fantastic. I think it took a lot of courage. In addition to that, Secretary Kennedy, I believe, or maybe President Trump, I'm not sure, ended the practice of American doctors essentially getting paid to vaccinate children, right? They get bonuses,
Yes.
which is such a corruption of the medical, trust between a patient and a doctor. Um, so it's wonderful. I mean, and I think it's very good messaging to say, hey, Europeans only have 11, because it's hard to argue with that. Europeans are pretty healthy. you know, they look, like they're managing fine. And there aren't sweeping, it's interesting, there aren't sweeping pandemics in Europe that are worse than in the United States. You can't make that case. The people are dropping dead of typhoid or polio in Europe compared to the United States. So it's a very clever, it's eye-opening. Like, I didn't realize Europeans only had 11. I think I knew we had 72, which is crazy because when I was a child, it was 3. So I think it's very well done. I think the way Kennedy is messaging that parents can still get whatever vaccine they psychotically may want, they're just not going to be mandated, is very smart and high time. And I also think, again, it shows a lot of courage on President Trump's part, a lot of integrity, because he didn't have to do it. He's infuriating very powerful interests, and it's a very pure piece of policy. That's going to make. I mean, pharma funds both sides of the aisle, so he's making his support. He's making Republicans as well as Democrats really angry at him, and big pharma angry at him, and he's saving a lot of children from needless injury and maybe worse.
No, and it seems like I think the first Trump administration was maybe more chaotic. This one, to me, actually, that trust that he's put in Bobby Kennedy to drive this, and despite the fact they're on different sides of the political aisle, on the left right, shows that actually this is a very different presidency and a lot more could happen, and that's maybe what scares parts of the left. This
Oh,
could
sure.
be more efficient.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if Trump keeps going like this, the existential reason to have Democrats will no longer exist, because they've come so far from their ideological roots of working people, labor, women's rights. I mean, it's and the fraud explains a lot. If you're underpinned by massive fraud, you really don't you don't want to waste time on an agenda that makes sense to voters, right? You don't have to. The other thing that President Trump is doing is, I think there's going to be a lot more revelation of Smartmatic and Dominion voting systems, which are, as I recall, based in Venezuela. I think he's going to reveal that the 2020 election really was stolen. And if we have real election integrity across the country, even just reforms like paper ballots and same-day counting, it may turn out that very few cities are actually blue. As I'm learning in New York, we don't know he really got all those votes. They won't let us look. So that could be the case across the country. It's going to be a really interesting year. I'm so sorry I have to go.
That's okay, Naomi. I appreciate your time. I know you're feeling under the weather also, but thank you so much for giving us your
Thank
time
you,
today.
Peter. Thank you so much. Take care and Happy New Year. Bye.